Ready to start? Okay. Hello, and welcome to our session on open source forests, the case for evolution versus engineered design. We're very excited to join you for the PyCon US 2023 Maintainer Summit. Hello, I'm Amanda Casari. I'm a pale white woman with light, shorter hair who wears glasses. I'm currently leading a team focused on research and education in Google's Open Source Programs Office.
And I'm Calvin Johnson, also part of the Open Source Programs Office, where I lead a team working to support the open source ecosystem through programs, funding, and outreach.
We would like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the various lands on which we meet today. I'm joining you from land which has served as a site of sustenance, community, meeting, and exchange among indigenous peoples since time immemorial. The Western Abenaki are the traditional stewards of these forests, lands, and waters, which they call Indakina, or homeland. We respect their spiritual and lived connections to this region and remember the hardships they've endured, both past and present, including violence and forced displacement at the hands of colonizing peoples.
And I'm joined from the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people.
As we gather for this physically dispersed and virtually constructed meeting, as we share our knowledge, teaching, and learning practices, may we give thanks to the opportunity to share in the joys of this place and to protect it. For those who it helps, you can access our slides at bit.ly/PyCon MS23-open source-forest-slides. You can also access a written transcript of this talk at bit.ly/PyCon MS23-open source-forest-transcript.
Right. Today, we will very briefly cover an intro to the corporate funding of open source, evolutionary versus engineered systems, evolutionary frameworks for the open source ecosystems, and share some of our references and additional resources. So to start things off, let's talk about where corporate open source funding comes from. I'll start by saying, like all things in open source, there is a ton of variability to how this is done, and we are by no means trying to overgeneralize. While the specifics of where funding comes from will vary from company to company, there are some well-established structures and constraints in how these funds are managed and distributed. So a few of the common places where we'll see funding originating in big companies are marketing teams, which may aim to improve how the company, products, or tools are seen and used by open source communities. It can come from recruiting, where companies are looking to hire great talent from open source communities that they work in, or from engineering teams looking to support the projects they depend on or to advance their own work in open source communities. The priorities can vary depending on where that funding is coming from. There can be different objectives and priorities that the organization is looking to advance, and they can change from budget year to budget year. So one of the hardest parts of navigating corporate funding of open source is around these moving targets and trying to predict what may change in the future. This is especially difficult at times like today, where we're seeing changing economic climate and tightening budgets, where companies are more likely than ever to look to make sure they know and understand and can communicate the impact of the funding on their priorities. When we talk about impact, we should remember that corporate budgets are often tied to impact, which will vary from year to year and have an effect on the yearly budget. What metrics will vary, but this is a central way in which the sort of program effectiveness is measured. So while difficult to measure, this is the lens that budget owners often need to view their programs through when working in open source. So any recipient of funding should make sure they have an understanding of how the impact of the funding is being measured and how it will be evaluated year to year. And finally, just when it comes to providing the funding that is actually distributed, this is not easy coming from a large company. So it's not as simple as cutting a check. Large companies have rigorous and bureaucratic payment processes that can be out of sync with what's easiest for maintainers and communities. And so even if an engineering team identifies a project that they rely on and would like to support, making contact with the maintainers, structuring a contract, and financially supporting is not always simple, or sometimes even possible. We often need to partner with organizations and foundations. So we work with all sorts of open source foundations. We work through organizations like Open Collective, and occasionally need to get creative in other ways. But this is difficult to do and scale globally.
Speaking about scaling globally, we have to keep in mind all of these funding and business constraints when we talk about changing our approach, because they do define the kinds of constraints we must operate within when we think about investments and sponsoring open source work. So to put our view of open source in as a larger group in context, we should very briefly introduce the difference between engineered and evolutionary systems. And when we say engineered here, we are referring to system designs which assume top-down control over elements, processes, reactions, and outcomes. And our goal here isn't to criticize this specific type of planning and system design. There are many kinds of systems where highly regulated, strictly controlled environments keep us safe and allow great leaps of engineering feats. So top-down control, planning, and funding over large systems generally keep our society safe and moving forward, especially when risks are high. Engineered systems design typically focuses on a long-term solution for a large critical project, and there's usually an end goal in mind. Open source isn't like this. There's no end goal in mind. There's no large collective high stakes roadmap that we can all point to as the best, lowest risk way to get from here to there. Quite frankly, we're all doing our best to make it up as we go along. So how can we as a community make decisions about where to go next, what resources we need, and what is best for us both individually and collectively? This is where complexity theory and evolutionary systems design can help us. So as a very brief introduction into complexity theory, which is the conceptual framework which defines complex systems, we're going to borrow from my 2021 talk with Julia Ferrioli on black swans in open source. So complexity theory states that while complex systems are unpredictable, they are constrained by order-generating rules. A complex system has components that interact in multiple ways, following local rules. There's no unifying rule to define all features or all interactions, and the emergent system itself is greater than the sum of its parts. So when examining the individual layers of open source, we can see components that interact in multiple ways, following local rules. There's no unifying rule to define all interactions in open source, and the emergent system itself is greater than the sum of its parts. So we can confidently say that open source is a complex system. Now, complex systems can be evolutionary systems, which are driven by mutations where the most fit elements survive and the less fit die down. The benefits of evolutionary systems is that by its nature of being adaptive, they can allow us to design for resiliency, scalability, reproducibility, and transparency. One last small point to bring up that influences our brains as we're thinking about these kinds of design and analysis is that when thinking about open source, we should take into consideration a key difference between systems and ecosystems. Ecosystems modeling must account for nutrient and energy flows, which represent in part the influence that living organisms have on their environment. So in business talk, we represent this generally as resources, when what we actually mean are people, and these people must earn money in a primarily capitalist economy to survive. So with the briefest of introductions of all these things that are shaping our brain and our way that we're approaching this, we hope this presents you with where we are and where we are headed towards creating a framework to organically identify resources and needs within an open source community as it evolves over time. Today, we have a few operating principles we are developing that we would like to share. The first of these is that if we consider that open source consists of components that ultimately interact with each other, we have to approach each component both individually and as a connected element. In this case, solitary nodes are not dangerous, but they are a sign of high risk within an ecosystem. Ideally, we can work with contributors, maintainers, and communities in open source to move away towards any single point of failure. This also brings us to the very important point that ecosystems themselves have no single points. As components that interact in multiple ways, holding a solitary point of view or only identifying single interactions can demonstrate that you're failing to account for missing stairs, hidden work, or contributors that may not be identified as critical. This is the person who has the point of view, and that's something that you must challenge. So part of our research and work is to shine more spotlights where more visibility would enable better decision-making.
Importantly, there's no single approach that is right for everything. We try not to start with an idea and try and force the world into a specific shape, but instead find what is working well and figure out how to give that what it needs to grow and be successful. Different projects will need different things at different times in their life cycles. We need to meet those projects where they are. We also need to support the larger ecosystem, not just the parts. We think about more than just funding the projects and individuals, but also frameworks around supporting mentorship and strengthening onboarding documentation and practices to ensure projects are growing sustainably. The system is greater than the sum of its parts, but that means the whole system needs support. Okay, we recognize that you may still be asking what this all has to do with open source and forests. A few months ago, Amanda and I were talking about how scientific understanding for forests has changed in recent years, popularized by a book called The Secret Life of Trees, written by a former forester turned forester ecologist turned public forest steward. This book describes emerging research that has challenged our understanding of forests and shown ways that trees and forests are more interconnected than we ever expected. While these connections are still not well understood, what we know is that our engineered environments in agriculture and man-made forests don't carry the same level of connectedness that is found in wild forest ecosystems. We think it's worthwhile to examine the parallels we see in forests and open source, especially how the elements that make an open source project successful can face similar challenges at the intersection of organic community projects and more top-down strategic corporate planning. We put this talk together to start bringing into the community our ideas around examining the differences between evolutionary versus engineered systems and what we are still learning about the natural world and how we might learn about if we view open source ecosystems as forests rather than marketplaces.
So if you're interested in learning more about the kinds of science that are shaping our thinking, we encourage you to check out both The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wollenben and The Computational Beauty of Nature by Gary William Flake. If you'd like to learn more about our team's work, you can find us online at both opensource.google and opensource.dev. And again, you can find copies of these slides at bit.ly/PyCon ms-open source-forest-slides.
And we are very proud of ourselves for not making a single see the forest for the trees pun once in a talk about forests. We hope you appreciated our restraint. Thank you so much for your time today.
(14 minutes, 16 seconds).
Nice.
Yeah, so let me stop the recording.